This morning, and welcome to Wine Intelligence's first ever seminar program here at ProWein. You all ought to be congratulated, one, for surviving this far in the show, two, getting up early enough to come and see us for this first session, and three, actually finding this place in the labyrinth that is ProWein. So well done to all of you, and you get the fresh coffee and the cold drinks and all the other good stuff that comes with that. This is the first time we've exhibited and offered a seminar program at ProWein, and there is a reason for that, or several reasons in fact. One is that ProWein is now quite an important show for a lot of people, and for us as well, as a company that serves the global wine business. The second reason is that this year, Wine Intelligence is 10 years old, and the point that we've reached in our development means that one, we'd like to have a celebration or two, or in fact 10 this year. So we're going to have 10 events around the world, of which the first will be at 12 today, following the conclusion of our third seminar, and you're all welcome to stay for a drink or return for a drink if you have to go elsewhere in the interim, and we'll talk more about our 10th birthday and what we're doing and the awards that we're also giving out associated with it at about 12:15. Over the last 10 years, lots of things have changed in the world. In our world, we've gone from a very small company, myself and one other person in a very small office, to what I can only describe these days as a mini United Nations of people in 5 offices around the world, speaking, I think it's 10 languages, 15 nationalities, and quite scarily, we now produce reports and debrief documents and strategy documents for our clients in 6 languages, at least 4 of which I can't understand. So I have to place a lot of trust now in all of the people around me to do exactly as well, I suppose I would do, but also as the clients would expect us to do. So we're in a very different place now to where we were 10 years ago. The market for wine is also in a very different place than it was in 2002. And one of the reasons for that is going to be outlined by my colleague Maria in a moment. But more fundamentally, we're seeing massive, rapid, almost unprecedented changes in the way that we as an industry do business, both in terms of where we're selling our products, the kinds of products we're selling, be it higher or lower alcohol, or sparkling products, or products that mix wine with other drinks, how we sell it in terms of where it gets sold, be it in shops or restaurants or bars, or now increasingly online. And that will be the subject of our third presentation this morning, about the digital conversation of wine and where it fits. And finally, this idea of wine being somehow an aspirational product, not a necessity necessarily, which brings us into the luxury space, perhaps, and that will be the subject of the second presentation today. I'm going to get out of your way in a moment. I just need to tell you one thing, which I will come back and talk about a little bit later. On your chairs this morning, you've had hopefully 2 pieces of paper. One with just telling you a bit about the presentations this morning. The other is slightly more cryptic, which is a small piece of paper that says, "My wine wish is ... This is the bit where you come in and do something, I suppose for us, but also for your industry. Over the course of this year, we will be collecting people's wine wishes. So if you've always had something that you felt that we as an industry ought to be doing, or that you wanted to see happen, or that just was something that you felt personally would be a really good thing, then please write it down and hang it on the bottles that you'll see out in the corridor there with a bit of string, which I was cutting last night, so I can assure you it's a very high quality string and it's of the correct length. When you do that, what will happen is that we'll collect all of them up, and then what we will do is publish them on our website. So, just so you know, try to be nice, don't be too rude, but be frank and be demanding. You know, I have a few wine wishes, you know, one of which is that as an industry we really ought to think a bit more before we start spending money on things like buying, you know, new equipment, investing in new products. It'd be great if we did that thinking before we did the spending rather than afterwards, which seems to happen quite a lot. And I'm going to write that down and post it on my bottle in a minute. So it would be great if you could all do that. We'll also later on have a camera going around where you can actually do a video wine wish, which might be quite fun. One of my colleagues standing at the back and Jana there with said video camera is the person to see if you want to do more about that. Finally, in the digital world in which we operate, we have a hashtag for Twitter discussion, which is there, so hashtag ProWein @WineIntel. Please feel free during the course of this morning to note down your thoughts, and if you have any questions you'd like to ask panelists or the speaker, it's very, very helpful for all of us to know that, because we can either address them straight away in the presentation or at the very least address them directly afterwards. So that's enough from me for now. I'll be back a bit later. In the meantime, I'd very much like you to welcome my colleague Maria Troein to the stage. Maria is one of our project managers, one of our members of the United Nations, Sweden by way of the UK, by way of the USA, with a strong dose of Wuhan. And she will tell you a bit more about that when she comes up. She's one of the leaders of our Asia practice, and you'll be hearing from some of the other people involved in the work we do in Asia as part of the presentation. So please welcome Maria.
Thank you. Thank you again for getting here so early. The German spirit has clearly rubbed off on us all for an early start. Let me just see. I'm going to try to use this microphone so that everything can get caught in the video for people who will be listening to this after seminar. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you again for joining me. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Asian markets today, specifically China, Japan, South Korea, with a focus on China because that's where a lot of the questions we're getting from clients are coming from, but putting these three markets in context with each other and talking about some of the similarities and differences between them. I'm not sure if we have any Mandarin speakers here in the audience. I can't do German, unfortunately, but if anybody would like to discuss either Mandarin or in English after the presentation, happy to answer any questions that you have. We have, as Richard mentioned, a hashtag for the event. We also have a Weibo account, so if anybody is tweeting in Chinese on Weibo, you can use the same hashtag. And our account is Wine Intelligence with the Chinese characters Zhou Zhe, which is our Chinese name, 不他州的州，智慧的智。So that's another way to take part of the global conversation about what we'll be talking about today. So let me go straight into the presentation. I'm going to make sure that I leave some time for questions at the end as well. I know that you probably have a lot of things that you'd like to discuss. So I'm going to be talking about 5 things that you need to know about these markets. Some of them hold true across the market, some of them are a little bit different for the specific markets that we're looking at. I'll go into detail on that in a second. To start off with, I'd like to introduce the team behind this research. Originally, my colleague Ray had hoped that she would be able to be here to speak to you in person. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to make it, but you'll be hearing a little bit from her later on in the presentation instead. Ray and Jenny and I lead our Asia research. Ray is from Guangzhou in southern China, speaks Cantonese and Mandarin. So she looks after our research, especially in southern China and Hong Kong, and also our South Korean and Japanese research. Jenny is from Harbin in northern China. And then I'm not Chinese, as you might have been able to tell, but I spent some time in Wuhan in central China, where I studied Chinese. And that's my second Chinese home, you could say. So we each have a different part of China that we cover, north, central, and south. And talk a little bit more about some of the differences between those regions as well. Presentation. Okay, so let's go straight into what we feel that you need to know about these markets. So I have 5 points that I'd like to take you through. First, different Asian markets present very different challenges. This probably doesn't come as a surprise, but is an important reminder and is something that we easily forget when we think about Asia as a sort of region that we target. That really these 3 markets are 3 very, very different markets to do business in. Wine is seen as a healthy, fashionable, and social drink. I'll talk a little bit more about this across these markets. Wine as a gift is still driving the Chinese market. Again, probably not a surprise, but there are some twists and some ways that this is evolving in China especially. Branding needs to be tailored to local cultural needs. And then finally, if you want to meet your consumers in these markets, you need to go online. We'll talk about each of these in more detail. So let's start with the first point. Different Asian markets present very different challenges. When we at Wine Intelligence look at the wine markets that we do most of our work in, one way that we think about them is in terms of what stage of growth that they're in. Depending on where a market is in its stage of growth, the way that consumers interact with the wine category can vary quite a lot. So if we start over here on the left side, traditional established, these tend to be some of our Western European markets where wine has a very established place in the culture, but in some ways is losing that place to new beverages, might even be declining as a category, but has a very established sort of role for consumers. We then have mature established markets where growth is relatively stable. High growth established that are still see high growth, even though wine has become a core part of the beverage repertoire for consumers in these markets. Emerging, which some of the markets we're going to talk about today fall into, and then new emerging, that are really just starting to discover wine as a category. So if we look at the markets that we're going to be talking about today, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that we see China as an emerging market. So this is a market where we have an existing wine category, but it's still a relatively new product. Wine is growing from a low base, but it's growing very, very quickly. Very exciting market for us to work in, but because of the nature of the market, things change very quickly, it's evolving very quickly. In some ways it's hard to predict what direction things will take. We also see South Korea as an emerging market. This is something that is maybe a little bit more controversial. The growth rates in South Korea are not at all as high as in China, but given the way that consumers interact with wine in South Korea and the way the growth has gone sort of up and down in the past few years, it still has most of the characteristics of an emerging market. Japan, on the other hand, we see as a mature established market. Typically in mature established markets, per capita consumption is high and has plateaued. Per capita consumption in Japan, as we're going to see in a few minutes, isn't actually that high, but looking at the growth trends in Japan over the past 10 or 20 years, it seems that wine has had its growth spurt, has now stabled, sort of plateaued or reached a more stable level of growth, and wine has found its place in the beverage repertoire for Japanese consumers. So it's not changing and evolving as much as it is for consumers in China and South Korea. And when I talk a little bit more about the way that these markets are evolving, that should become a little bit clearer. If we look at per capita consumption in these markets, per capita consumption is much lower in these 3 Asian markets than it is in some of our more established Western markets. So where we have around 25 litres per capita in the UK, we have somewhere between 0.6 and 2.3 in these three markets. I should say that this is per capita consumption of both domestically produced and imported wine, which helps explain why this Chinese number is so much higher than the South Korean number. If we look just at imported wine, the Chinese number is actually more similar to the South Korean market, but relatively low per capita consumption overall. If we look then at the growth rates, slightly bigger differences between the markets. Sorry, stay with this for a second. Overall, in South Korea and Japan, in a 5-year perspective, growth has been relatively stable. As I mentioned, in South Korea, it's jumped up and down a little bit more, whereas in Japan, we seem to see a relatively stable market at this point. But not spectacular growth. In China, it's a different picture. The overall market has grown by 25% between 2006 and 2010. Imported wine grew by 64% in that same time period, which is obviously huge growth and very exciting for us in the industry, but means that the market is changing and evolving very quickly. We also see a very different picture between these three markets when we look at the split between imported and domestic wine. In China, imported wine is actually a relatively small part of the total wine market. Roughly 13% of sales by volume are imported wine. In Japan and South Korea, on the other hand, imported wine is a much bigger part of the total market. And what this means for us in terms of selling to these markets is that we're looking at a very different proposition in terms of who our competitors are. So in all three of these markets, really our main competitor is other beverages. Overall, the per capita consumption is low, and that's because consumers are going to other beverages like beer or local forms of liquor in these countries. But then when we look at the next tier of competitors, in China, the next big competitor is domestically produced wine. And because of various characteristics of this market, domestically produced wine is in a very, very strong position. So it's a difficult category for us to compete with. In Japan and South Korea, on the other hand, really we need to be thinking of other imported wine brands as our main competitor. And that presents a different situation in terms of how we approach these markets and how we try to win over new consumers, both to the imported wine category overall and to our brands specifically. Now, before I move on to this, we do research in all of these markets on a regular basis with consumers. In each market, we define who the target consumer is, and then we run a regular survey with a sample that's representative of that wine drinking population to understand their attitudes towards wine, what types of wine they're buying, why they're buying wine. We define this target a little bit differently in the three markets because of this split between imported and domestic wine. In China, we talk to imported wine drinkers specifically. So we look for people who drink imported wine at least twice a year and then interview them, interview a sample that's representative of that population. In Japan and South Korea, on the other hand, we talk to all wine drinkers. So we talk to people who are drinking both imported and domestic wine, and there we're looking at people who drink wine at least once a month instead, to understand what their attitudes towards wine are. And you get a very interesting picture when you then look at how these different consumer populations feel about wine and why they're drinking wine. One of the questions we ask is an attitude question to try to get a sense of how consumers overall feel about wine as a category. So we give them three options. We ask essentially if they're open to trying new brands, if they tend to stick to what they know, or if they decide which wine to buy based on price. In China, the top reason or the top attitude towards wine is trying new and different types of wine. So 66% of our sample in China say that they enjoy trying new and different types of wine on a regular basis. So that's an important reason for buying wine in China, the sense of exploration and exploring new styles. Now, this is actually true in South Korea as well. 56% of our consumers there say that they enjoy trying new and different styles of wine. And if we go back to that model of where the markets are in their growth stage, you'll remember that both of these markets are emerging markets. And that makes sense in a lot of ways, that consumers in a market where wine is a new emerging category, would like exploring and trying new styles. Now in Japan, on the other hand, where the market is relatively mature, where consumers know where wine fits for them as a category, this sense of exploration has become less important. Instead, the majority of consumers say that they don't mind what they buy as long as the price is right. Now again, this means we need to have very different strategies when we're targeting consumers in these different markets. A price-conscious consumer is very different from a consumer who's looking for something that's new and exciting. Okay, now that I've talked a little bit about the differences between these markets, I'm going to talk about some of the ways that the markets are similar to each other. One of the similarities between them is the overall view of what wine can offer, the reasons for why consumers would choose wine as a product. And really the overarching reasons are that wine is healthy, fashionable, and social. Now, if we start with healthy, the health benefits of wine are something that consumers in the West talk about as well, but nowhere near the level of how important this pitch is to Asian consumers. And it's seen as being healthy in a variety of ways. It's seen as being good for your skin, good for your heart. In China, for example, it's relatively common for older women to have a small glass of wine every evening before bed for the health benefits that it's seen as bringing. It's a fashionable drink. It's especially associated for younger people with an urban, sophisticated, cosmopolitan lifestyle. And it's also increasingly a social drink. It's seen as adding to creating a warm and friendly atmosphere. I think we have some numbers. These numbers are from China. So when we ask consumers why they drink wine, we allow them to choose up to 5 reasons. 94% say they drink wine because it's good for my health. That's the top motivation in China for drinking wine. 81% say they drink it because it's fashionable and modern. And 93% say they drink it because it helps to create a warm atmosphere. The motivation of drinking wine because it's healthy should in some way send some warning signals to us in the industry. It's been a very successful pitch so far, but it's something that could turn against us if, for different reasons, consumers start to focus on other aspects of wine, start to focus on the negative effects of alcohol, for example. Fashionable as well is something that could turn fairly easily. What we should be focusing on or trying to emphasize about wine as a product for these consumers is the social aspect of wine. What we as an industry would hope to see is for wine to start to become a default choice for social occasions, which puts wine in a much more sustainable position as a product than as a healthy choice or as a fashionable choice. My colleague Ray is going to talk a little bit more about this. We just started this video for you.
A recent trip back to...
Oh, sorry.
My recent trip back to China, I've noticed a few changes in Chinese consumers' drinking habits. My friends took me to a pub in downtown Guangzhou. I saw bunches of young professionals drinking wines on a Friday night. In a Thai restaurant in Shanghai, I met people ordering a bottle of Argentinian wine, very naturally to go with an informal dinner setting. For the wine market in China to continue to grow, we need to see wine becomes not just for special occasions, but also for common socializing occasions, like what I'm starting to see on my friends.
Okay, so this was our way of trying to bring a little bit more of our Asia team to share this research with you. So as Ray said, we would really hope to see wine become more of a default choice for social occasions in China. We're starting to see signs of it when we do research there and we talk to consumers there. But the default position is still that wine is for status occasions and for special occasions. Increasingly, we hope that it will become more and more for social occasions and for more relaxed social occasions. 3, wine as a gift is still driving the Chinese market. If any of you have been to China recently and walked into a store there, I'm sure you've seen the rows and rows of wine bottles that are clearly intended as gifts in elaborate packaging, often fancy wood boxes or expensive red boxes, sometimes sold in pairs, which is seen as an auspicious way to give wine as a gift. This is a very important motivation for, again, a reason for buying wine. Data from Rabobank estimates that about 60% of annual wine sales happen around the two major holidays, which is Chinese New Year here, Spring Festival, and then Mid-Autumn Festival and the National Day in the fall. At both those two occasions, buying wine as a gift for friends, families, colleagues, contacts has become a very, very common choice. So, as I mentioned, Chinese New Year here, Mid-Autumn Festival here. So this is an important driver of the market. A lot of volume is shifting around these two festivals. Another reason for buying, or another way that gifting has helped to push forward the Chinese market, isn't just personal gifting, but also corporate gifting. And with our next video clip, my colleague Jenny will talk a little bit about more about how that phenomenon has evolved.
Corporate and government gifting has a very unique stance in China's wine market, and it's gained a lot of attention over years among the trade. During the holiday season, companies and government institutions make imported wine as gift to their employees. In addition to that, it's also socially acceptable to make wine as gift to your business partners and your clients to nurture the relationship. In this instance, wines purchased for this purpose tend to be very expensive in order to show respect. This type of group purchase is mostly relationship-based, which means that you have to have the right contact with the key decision makers within the organization. It's a very attractive deal considering the big volume it cannot bring, and also the fact that the payment for the wines purchased tend to be in cash and paid immediately rather than on credit. But just because of the very nature of the relationship-based decision, it sometimes can carry risk. In the recent pre-interview program we did in China, one distributor just told me last New Year, one deal fell through at the last minute, even after the wines were shipped to China.
So essentially what's happening here is a company is buying a huge inventory of wine to give to their employees, to their contacts, to other businesses that they do work with. The decision on which wines to buy often happens through a relationship between somebody in that company who has been given the authority to make that decision and an individual distributor. If you win one of those deals, it can mean huge volumes. Anecdotally, I've been told by an importer in China that a spike in New Zealand sales came because of one of these deals. So you could actually see it in the overall country sales numbers. And then something like this can also fall through quite easily. So in some cases, we've heard of wines being shipped for this type of a transaction, and then at the last minute, the deal being canceled, and the wine just sitting in a warehouse in China with nowhere else to go because it was based on one of these one-off deals. So it's another interesting characteristic of the Chinese market specifically that has helped drive the market and create higher demand than there might otherwise have been, but is also dangerous in terms of a producer and sort of shipping wine to China. Point 4, branding needs to be tailored to local cultural needs. This may sound simple, but it's something that seems to be forgotten quite often. With China specifically, this is true for China, South Korea, and Japan, but most of the examples of sort of missing this point seem to have come from China in the past few years. An example that some of you might be familiar with is this brand Chilensis, which caused a bit of a scandal in southern China a few months back when it was released, or when it was brought to attention on the Chinese equivalent to Twitter, Weibo. The brand name in Cantonese sounds similar to a very rude word. Somebody picked this up, started retweeting it. It had 6,000 retweets or re-Weibos in the first 24 hours, 6,500 in total. Some people said it sounded stupid in Cantonese. It actually sounds close to a swear word. Young people thought this was very funny and started buying the brand. The price now in Hong Kong has gone up by about 20% because of the novelty value of this brand. And I actually talked to the brand owner here at ProWein, and he said that they're not entirely unhappy with how things have developed. it's been quite good for their sales. But when something like this happens, you want to be in control of it. So if your name is going to lead to this type of a viral campaign, ideally you would want it to be in a way that you as a brand owner have control over. This is something to be aware of, that you need to check not just that your brand name works in Japanese, Korean, Mandarin, but also in Cantonese. In this case, they might even have checked that it worked in Mandarin, but maybe not in Cantonese, which is what's spoken in southern China and in Hong Kong, and sometimes in other local dialects in different regions of China. And when we work with brand owners to make sure that their strategy works for China, the basic principle of doing this is to assume nothing. In other markets, often you can take a brand strategy and tailor it a little bit to the local needs. In China, you need to go back and check the basics. So you need to make sure that you benchmark what your competitors are doing and that your brand positioning and brand audit works for the consumers in that market. Then you can go on to look at whether your brand name works, whether your label is appealing, and also whether your back label is telling consumers what it needs to know. And back labels in some ways are more important in China than in other markets. Consumers are used to seeing front labels in their original versions, so written in English or in French, and usually it's a good decision to keep the front label as it is. It signals authenticity, shows that it's an imported wine. But there's important information that a non-English speaking consumer wouldn't be able to get from the front label. So instead what consumers do is they turn the bottle around and look at the back label to find out where the wine is from, what the varietal is, some basic information on taste and style. Your back label needs to communicate that in the way that best represents your product. And then you can look at your communications campaign and whether you're reaching out to consumers in the right way. And that brings us to the final point. If you want to meet your consumers in China, go online. China, South Korea, and Japan, I should say again. Now we're back to a point that holds true across all of these three markets. Now if we look at the extent to which consumers are using online information to learn about wine, whether or not consumers are going online to talk about wine, in most of our Western markets, there are consumers who are going online. Our estimate is somewhere between 30 and 45% in Germany, the US, UK, in terms of how many of our regular wine drinkers would look for wine information online. That picture is quite different in South Korea and China. 77% of South Korean consumers in our estimate, South Korean wine drinkers in our estimate, go online to learn about wine. 69% in China. So what that means is that really the majority of your consumers will be online talking about wine, researching wine. There are some reasons for why this is. Asian consumers are known in other product categories as well to be much more likely to research products online. There's low trust in traditional sources in these countries. So there's low trust in shop staff recommendations, in printed media. There are fewer people around them. In a country where per capita consumption is low, you're less likely to find somebody next to you who can recommend a good wine to you. A lot of the online campaigns have been run in a very professional way. There's also an element of saving face, which is important in all of these markets. It can be embarrassing in a culture where you have to be shown as knowing what you're talking about to walk around a wine store for 30 minutes trying to figure out what wine to buy. But online, you can do that in a safe setting. You can browse for as long as you want. You can ask for recommendations without exposing yourself and showing to others that you're not quite sure which one to buy. But all of those things help explain why online is so important in these markets. But really the big takeaway is that it is very important, and you need to be online if you want to meet your consumers. When you go online, you also need to remember that they're on different websites than we are on here in the West. And this will differ for all of these three markets. China as an example, they're not on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter. They're on a whole host of other websites. So instead of Twitter, for example, we have Weibo, which is, in the wine category especially, a very important source of information at the moment. And this changes quickly, so it's important to keep track of where you want to go to talk to your specific consumers. And that was all I had to share with you this morning. I think I have about 5 or 10 minutes to take some questions, and then I'll be at the back of the room to take more questions after the seminar. Thank you very much. Does anybody have questions? Is that okay? give you the microphone.
Good morning.
Good
My
morning.
name is Antonio. I have a question regarding the language to be used in the internet. You told us that in some parts of China, in southern China, Cantonese is the main language. The rest of China, I believe Mandarin would be the most important one. If you're trying to develop a website or a FAQ somehow to give information about your wines, is it very important to have both languages? Or if you have, for instance, Mandarin, would this be enough on a first stage to give you know, all the answers you need to the rest of the market in southern China?
Thank you. That's a great question. So the question was on which language to use in China specifically. So it's a little bit complicated in China. The written language doesn't correspond exactly to the spoken language. There are two character systems that are used. Traditional characters, which are used mainly in Hong Kong and in Taiwan and overseas Chinese communities, and then simplified characters, which are used in mainland China. You can read both Cantonese and Mandarin. So if you're a Mandarin or Cantonese speaker, you'd be likely to be able to read both of these character systems. It's actually not that complicated to set up a website that can display both simplified and traditional characters, and that's a smart thing to do. Consumers would likely be able to read your website, whichever character set you use, but using both character sets makes it more convenient for them and shows that you've taken the effort to make the website as readable as possible for those consumers. Next question? You pass the microphone back.
Just an interesting point that I picked up in the last couple of days. On the back label, as you highlighted, highly important. And somebody was saying don't use the traditional blackcurrant, cassis, cedar, violets, words that, or smells that we associate with Cabernet possibly. Don't use those words when they don't have an association in China with those words. Maybe they don't have blackcurrants or red cherries or currants. So try and utilize the correct words that they would understand and associate from either cooking or previous encounters with liquor. But just it was an interesting point, and I picked up on that very quickly and realized just how much sense that made. Don't go in there with a Western culture. You've got to just approach it so differently. So it wasn't a question, it was just a remark.
Yeah, let me see. I might be able to use this microphone instead. Yes, that's a very good point. So the point was that when you're describing tastes and flavors to Asian consumers, you need to use descriptions from their repertoire rather than from our repertoire. And there are some descriptions that we commonly use in the wine industry that can be quite difficult for Chinese consumers to understand. Certain berries, for example, like blackcurrants, that aren't as common, that Chinese consumers might not be as likely to have tasted. And there's a whole art evolving around this. In terms of which flavors and which descriptions you use in China and South Korea and Japan to describe the taste in a way that makes sense to consumers. And in a way, as the market is evolving, this is becoming more important. Consumers are starting more and more to choose wines based on what they think they'll like, rather than what signals the status that they're looking for. Status is still very, very important in all these three markets. But the taste descriptors are becoming more important, especially for more confident and more experienced consumers. So it's something that's worth thinking about in terms of how you describe your wines. Any other questions?
Is there much difference between the markets as to which wines are being bought or are more popular, which countries, which regions?
So the question was on if there are differences between the markets in terms of which wines are being bought. It's a good question. There are differences. It's hard to summarize in just a few words. There are differences between these three markets and then differences within China. In a way, a smart Chinese brand strategy would even split China into sub-regions and have a different approach between them. Overall, the trend has been that more conservative consumers have stuck more with red wine and with more traditional styles, so with the sort of more premium French styles of red wine. And then as consumers have become more confident, they've moved to a broader repertoire of styles, so adding in white wine, sparkling wine. So if we then look at the markets in terms of growth trends, the newer parts of the markets in China, so tier 2 cities, for example, as well as newer consumers in Asia, are still buying more of the traditional styles, whereas some of the more experienced consumers in Japan, for example, and in some of the big cities in China are starting more to buy other styles of wine, other source countries, other sort of flavor profiles, such as slightly sweeter styles, or white wines, or even rosé wines, to a much smaller, but to some extent.
Is it true that in China, particularly, the generic word wine, when translated, simply means alcohol? And how do we get across the fact that grape-based wine is in fact different to the generic meaning of the word wine?
Yes, there is the one-word translation for wine that's commonly used in China. That's actually the one that's still taught in school for most Chinese school children. It means just alcohol. There is a word that means wine, which is the one that we use in all of our research that's used in the trade in China. That means literally grape alcohol. And that means wine, and consumers know that word, but it's not used as commonly. The other word that Chinese consumers use quite a lot is red alcohol, which is used to mean wine generically, but obviously carries strong connotations of red wine. And that's another thing that's influenced how consumers think about wine in China. Wine for a long time has been red wine, essentially. And that, again, is starting to change. Interestingly, when we do consumer research, often consumers will talk about white wine, but still use the word red alcohol to refer to it. But over time, I expect that the term of the trade is using, grape alcohol, will start to filter down to consumers and will make it clear where wine sits in the repertoire of beverages. Question over here?
Thank you. Two questions in one. The first one is when you're talking about China, 1.1 liter per person. You're taking the whole population, so because that's not making sense to me. And the other question is, what about the enotourism or wine tourism phenomena? Can you give just a few input from which city are mainly living, where the phenomenon is taking place? And if you know a big name of this tour operator.
Sorry, a big name of a tour agent?
Yes.
So if I start with the first question, per capita consumption, that's a very good point, actually. So the number that I showed you is based on total volume over divided by the adult population. So it's obviously including a lot of people in that per capita consumption who aren't drinking wine at all. I don't have the numbers here on. Actually, we don't have absolute numbers on consumption just among the people who are drinking wine. I don't think that those numbers tend to be very difficult to compile in any market. We can try to estimate that, so what the consumption is just among the people who are drinking wine, which I think is what you're interested in. It's still much lower than in Western markets. The difference isn't as dramatic as the numbers that I showed you, but there is still a difference. So even the people who are drinking wine in China, for example, aren't drinking it as frequently on average as the people who are drinking wine in Germany or in the UK. So it's still not as much a part of the everyday routine for these consumers as it can be in some of our Western markets. Wine tourism, that's an interesting question. We haven't seen that as a big phenomenon yet. There is some wine tourism. At the moment, it seems to be, my impression at least is that it seems to be mainly at foreign tourists. There are some tour agencies, I don't know any off the top of my head, but I know of some tour agencies that organize tours to Chinese wineries, for example, that seem to be aimed at a very, very affluent Chinese clientele, or to people from other countries coming to China to sort of see what wine production there could look like. There's some cellar door, so most of the big, especially domestic wineries in China, and some foreign wineries have set up ways for consumers to interact with their brand. So with the big domestic ones, you can go out to a part of the vineyard and see do a tour of what wine production looks like. With some foreign brands, there's sometimes a type of interactive shop in one of the big cities where consumers can come and learn a little bit more about the brand. It doesn't seem to have sort of taken on a major role yet for consumers in terms of introducing them to new brands or building brand affinity. But it would be something interesting to track to see if China starts to evolve something more similar to Australia with cellar door, where it is actually very important in terms of building a relationship with a brand. Any other questions? I have time for one more before we... No? Okay. In that case, thank you. We are going to take a 10-minute break, I think. Yeah, 5 or 10-minute break, and then the next seminar will start around 10.